My daughter's fiancé demanded $5 million during a family dinner. He didn't ask. He didn't suggest. He simply announced it the way someone announces a final price. $5 million should cover everything, Lucas Grant said calmly as he slid a leather folder across the table. The venue, the guests, the design. He glanced at Emily and smiled. Emily deserves the wedding we always dreamed about, he said. A wedding people will talk about for years. For a moment, no one spoke. The dining room around us was quiet except for the soft clink of glasses and the distant murmur of other conversations. Warm light from the chandeliers fell across the white tablecloth. Lucas looked completely relaxed. Confident. Almost entertained. Beside him sat his mother, Margaret Grant, perfectly composed in a cream-colored suit. She watched me carefully with the calm patience of someone who believed the outcome of this conversation had already been decided. My daughter Emily sat next to me. And she looked pale. $5 million, I repeated slowly. Lucas nodded as if confirming a perfectly reasonable number. Yes. Of course the final number might change slightly depending on the floral design and entertainment. He tapped the folder. We've been working with one of the most exclusive wedding planners in Texas. He opened the folder and turned it toward me. Inside were glossy pages filled with photos, venue layouts, vendor lists, and carefully printed cost estimates. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked carefully prepared. Lucas leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. I know this may sound like a lot, he said lightly. But Emily deserves something extraordinary. Margaret tilted her head slightly toward me. In our family, she said softly, a wedding reflects the status of the families involved. Her eyes briefly moved across the table. Across my watch. Across my suit. And of course, she continued gently, the bride's family usually makes sure the celebration matches that status. Lucas gave a small approving nod. He's a successful man, Lucas added, gesturing toward me. $5 million shouldn't be a problem. Emily shifted slightly in her chair. Lucas didn't notice. Or maybe he simply didn't care. He turned another page in the folder. The venue alone will cost around $1.2 million, he said casually. Another page. Imported cherry blossoms flown in from Japan. Another page. Private orchestra. Ice sculptures. International catering. Another page. The dress will be custom designed. Then he closed the folder again and looked directly at me. So yes, he said with a confident smile. $5 million. Across the table, Emily's fingers tightened around her glass. Lucas noticed. He reached over and placed his hand gently over hers. Don't worry, he said warmly. Your father will understand. Then he looked back at me. Waiting. Margaret's polite smile remained perfectly still. Lucas clearly believed this conversation had already ended. That this was simply a formality. That I would nod, maybe ask a few polite questions, and then quietly agree. That was when I felt something brush against my knee under the table. Emily's hand. She slipped something into my palm so quickly that no one else noticed. A small folded piece of paper. I didn't look down. Instead, I kept my eyes on Lucas. For 35 years I had worked inside courtrooms. First as a prosecutor. Later as a judge specializing in financial crimes. I had watched people lie under oath. I had watched criminals build perfect stories. And I had learned something very simple. When someone talks about money with that much confidence, it usually means they believe the person across the table will never question them. Lucas Grant believed that. He believed this conversation was already finished. Slowly, without looking, I opened the paper in my hand beneath the table. I ran my thumb across the indentation of the pen. Emily had pressed hard when she wrote the words. 4 of them. Dad. Something is wrong. Help. I folded the note again and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Lucas was still watching me. Waiting. Margaret's smile had not changed. Emily stared down at the tablecloth. I lifted my glass, took a slow sip of water, and placed it back down. Then I looked Lucas Grant directly in the eyes. And smiled. "Prove it," I said quietly. Lucas blinked. "What?" "Prove it," I repeated calmly. For the first time since the conversation began, his confidence flickered. Just slightly. Not fear. Not yet. But confusion. And in my experience, confusion is always the first crack in a very expensive lie. Before I continue this story, let me ask you to do something. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and write in the comments which city you're watching from right now. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me explain something Lucas Grant didn't know at that moment. My name is Daniel Whitaker. I'm 70 years old. And for 35 years I was a judge who specialized in financial crime. Which means Lucas Grant had just made a very expensive mistake. Because men like him expect silence. They expect embarrassment. They expect people to avoid asking questions. What they never expect is someone who has spent decades studying exactly how their schemes work. Lucas Grant thought he was presenting a wedding plan. But to me, it already looked like evidence. And by the time this story ended, that $5 million demand would cost him something far more valuable. His freedom. Lucas Grant expected me to argue. Most people would have. $5 million is the kind of number that usually causes either anger or silence. Lucas clearly expected one of those reactions. What he did not expect was curiosity. "Prove it," I had said. The confusion on his face lasted only a second before he forced a polite smile back into place. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her tone smooth and patient. "I believe Mr. Whitaker simply isn't used to events at this level," she said. "Luxury weddings require significant planning." I nodded slowly as if considering that. "I'm sure they do," I said calmly. "That's why I'd like to see the contracts." Lucas blinked again. "The contracts?" "Yes," I replied. "Vendor agreements. Deposits. Signed proposals. Things like that." Lucas opened the folder again and turned a few pages. "These are the estimates," he said, sliding the papers toward me again. I glanced down. Beautiful photos. Elegant layouts. Large numbers printed beside words like venue, floral installation, entertainment. But something was missing. Names. Companies. Legal details. Things I had spent decades looking for. "These are estimates," I said quietly. Lucas shrugged. "That's how wedding planning works." Margaret nodded. "The planner gives the projections first. Contracts come later." I looked back at Lucas. "And the planner's name?" Lucas hesitated for half a second. "Michelle Lawson. Company? Elite Wedding Designs." I watched his eyes carefully as he spoke. People often reveal the truth in the small pauses between words. "And where is this company located?" I asked. Lucas smiled again. "Downtown Dallas." "Address?" Another small pause. "I don't have the exact address memorized," he said. "But I can send it to you." Emily sat very still beside me. I could feel the tension in her shoulders. Lucas turned another page in the folder. "You're focusing on the wrong details," he said lightly. "The point is that this wedding will be unforgettable." Margaret nodded approvingly. "A celebration people will talk about for years." Lucas closed the folder again. "And of course," he added, "we would need the initial deposit within the next 2 weeks." 2 weeks? I asked. Yes, he said. The venue won't wait forever. If we don't secure the date soon, someone else will take it. I folded my hands on the table. And the deposit amount? Lucas didn't hesitate this time. 2 million. Emily's fingers tightened again around her glass. Lucas glanced at her. It's just the first step, he said gently. Everything else comes after. Then he looked back at me. And honestly, he added casually, families like yours usually don't hesitate over numbers like that. Margaret gave a quiet approving nod. A father should want his daughter's wedding to be extraordinary, she said. The pressure in the room thickened. Lucas leaned forward slightly. So, he said, can we move forward? I looked at him quietly for a moment. Then I nodded once. That makes sense. Lucas relaxed. Margaret's smile widened slightly. They thought the conversation had finally reached the point they expected. But I had spent too many years in courtrooms to stop at the first answer. Tell me something, Lucas, I said. Yes. How long have you been working with this planner? About 3 months. And you trust them with $5 million? Of course. No contracts. No office address. No documentation. Lucas leaned back in his chair again. You're overthinking this, he said calmly. Margaret added softly. Not everything in life requires an investigation. I smiled slightly. That's interesting, I said. Why? Because investigations are exactly what I spent 35 years doing. Lucas frowned. Margaret's smile tightened. And Emily slowly lifted her eyes to look at me for the first time since the dinner began. I reached for the folder again and gently closed it. Let's do this properly, I said. Lucas tilted his head. What do you mean? I'd like to meet this planner of yours, I said calmly. In person. Lucas and Margaret exchanged a quick glance. Just 1 second. But it was enough. That tiny look between them told me something my instincts had already suspected. This conversation had just moved somewhere they didn't want it to go. Lucas cleared his throat. That shouldn't be a problem. Good, I said. Then let's arrange a meeting. Lucas forced another smile. We can do that. Margaret picked up her glass of wine and took a slow sip. Then she looked at me again. You're being very cautious, Mr. Whitaker. I nodded. I've always believed money deserves caution. Lucas leaned forward slightly. Does this mean you're willing to help with the wedding? I held his gaze. It means, I said calmly. I'm willing to examine every dollar. Lucas smiled again. But this time the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. And when someone's smile stops reaching their eyes, that's usually the moment a lie realizes it's about to be exposed. Family dinners are supposed to be warm, comfortable, predictable. But the moment Lucas agreed to arrange a meeting with his mysterious wedding planner, something in the room changed. It was subtle. The kind of shift most people would miss. But I had spent most of my life studying people who were very good at hiding things. And when people who believe they are in control suddenly lose that control, they begin making small mistakes. Lucas tried to continue the conversation as if nothing unusual had happened. He asked the waiter for another bottle of wine. Margaret complimented the restaurant. Emily barely touched her food. But I noticed the details. Lucas was speaking a little faster now. Margaret's smile appeared and disappeared too quickly. And every few minutes, Lucas glanced at his phone. Not checking messages. Just looking at the screen. As if expecting something. Or someone. So, Lucas said finally, cutting another piece of steak, once we secure the venue, everything else moves quickly. I nodded slightly. I imagine it does. It's a very tight schedule, he continued. Luxury venues are booked months in advance. Margaret leaned in again. That's why we wanted to discuss this now, she said gently. Timing matters. Lucas added. And once the deposit is placed, the planner begins coordinating the rest of the vendors. I looked at him calmly. And you're comfortable transferring $2 million to someone you've only worked with for 3 months? Lucas forced a light laugh. That's how this industry works. I tilted my head slightly. Interesting. Lucas raised an eyebrow. Why? Because in most industries, I said calmly, people prefer knowing who they're paying. Margaret set her glass down a little harder than necessary. You seem very suspicious, Mr. Whitaker. I'm careful, I corrected. Lucas wiped his mouth with a napkin. You're treating this like a business transaction. I smiled faintly. $5 million usually is. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Lucas leaned forward slightly. You don't trust me. Emily looked up immediately. Lucas. But he continued. You think I'm trying to cheat you? Margaret turned toward him quickly. That's not what he's saying. Lucas ignored her. His eyes stayed on me. I love your daughter, he said firmly. I plan to marry her. And instead of supporting us, you're interrogating me like I'm in a courtroom. I held his gaze calmly. You're the one asking for $5 million. Lucas's jaw tightened. Margaret spoke again, her voice now carrying a sharper edge. This is beginning to feel insulting. Emily shifted uncomfortably beside me. Maybe we should just. No, Lucas interrupted quietly. He looked back at me. If you're going to question my integrity, say it clearly. The room had grown very still. Even the waiter approaching our table slowed slightly before deciding not to interrupt. I folded my hands together. Integrity is proven with facts, I said. Lucas exhaled slowly through his nose. So what exactly do you want? I answered without hesitation. The meeting we discussed. With the planner. With contracts. With documentation. Lucas leaned back again. The confident smile returned to his face. But this time it looked thinner. More controlled. You'll get your meeting, he said. Margaret nodded slowly. Michelle will be happy to explain everything. Lucas looked at Emily again. You trust me, don't you? Emily hesitated. Just for a second. Then she nodded. Yes. Lucas smiled. Good. But I noticed something else. When Emily lowered her eyes again. Her hands were shaking slightly. And that small detail confirmed something that had been growing in the back of my mind since the moment she slipped me that note. Emily wasn't just worried. She was afraid. The dinner ended shortly after that. Lucas insisted on paying the bill. Margaret thanked me politely for the conversation. Emily barely said a word as we walked toward the parking lot. The night air outside was cooler than I expected. Lucas wrapped an arm around Emily's shoulders. I'll call you tomorrow, he told her. She nodded. Then Lucas turned back to me. We'll arrange the meeting soon, he said confidently. I gave him a small nod. I'm looking forward to it. Lucas smiled one last time. Then he and Margaret walked toward their car. I watched them leave. Their silhouettes disappearing under the streetlights. Emily stood beside me quietly. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she looked at me. Dad, she whispered. I turned toward her. Her voice trembled slightly. What if you're right? I looked back toward the dark parking lot where Lucas's car had just disappeared. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to say what I had already begun to suspect. If I'm right, I said quietly. Then tonight was only the beginning. That night, Emily barely spoke on the drive home. The city lights moved silently across the windshield as we drove through downtown Dallas. I kept my eyes on the road, but I could feel the tension sitting beside me. Finally, she broke the silence. Dad. I didn't know how to tell you. I glanced at her briefly. Tell me what? She hesitated. Lucas gets nervous when people ask too many questions. That sentence stayed in the air for a moment. Nervous how? I asked calmly. Emily stared out the window. He says people with money always assume the worst about him. I nodded slowly. That's a convenient explanation. She looked down at her hands. He said the wedding planner was handling everything. I never met her. I just trusted him. That was the first detail that bothered me. You don't plan a $5 million wedding through someone you've never met. Emily, I said gently, has he ever shown you contracts? Emails? Anything official? She shook her head. No. He said the planner prefers private clients. Private clients. I had heard that phrase many times before. Usually right before a fraud case collapsed. When we reached my house, Emily stayed in the car for a moment. Do you think he's lying? She asked quietly. I didn't answer right away. Right now, I said carefully, I think we need more information. She nodded slowly. Okay. Inside the house, the quiet felt heavier than usual. Emily went upstairs. I went to my study. Old habits never really disappear. 35 years in financial crime courtrooms teach you one thing above all else. When something feels wrong, start with the paper trail. I opened my laptop and typed the first name Lucas had given me. Elite Wedding Designs. The search results appeared instantly. Several websites. Instagram pages. Luxury event portfolios. At first glance, everything looked legitimate. Professional photos. Elegant weddings. Hundreds of smiling couples. But experience teaches you not to stop at the first layer. I opened the company registration database. Typed the company name again. Nothing. I tried variations. Still nothing. That was strange. A company supposedly organizing million-dollar weddings should absolutely exist in the registration records. I leaned back in my chair. Then I searched the website domain registration. The result appeared almost immediately. The website had been created 4 months ago. 4 months. Lucas had told me he'd been working with the planner for 3. Which meant the company itself barely existed. That wasn't illegal. But it was exactly how many scams begin. I opened the website again and began checking the wedding photos. Beautiful venues. Luxury decorations. Perfect lighting. But something caught my attention. One photograph showed a wedding at a well-known Dallas hotel. I knew that venue. I had attended a charity event there years ago. I zoomed in on the image. Then I opened the hotel's official website. The same photo appeared in their gallery. Exactly the same. Except on their site it belonged to a wedding from 6 years ago. I checked another image. And another. Within 15 minutes the pattern became clear. The wedding photos on Elite Wedding Designs weren't theirs. They had been copied. From photographers. From venues. From real weddings that had nothing to do with this company. That was the first real crack in Lucas Grant's story. Not proof. Not yet. But the beginning of it. I sat back in my chair and looked at the screen. Lucas had asked me for $5 million. $2 million within 2 weeks. And the company supposedly organizing the wedding had only existed for 4 months. I printed the domain registration. Then I saved several screenshots of the stolen photos. Just in case. Upstairs I heard Emily walking slowly across the floor. She hadn't gone to sleep. I closed the laptop halfway. The first rule of uncovering a lie is simple. Don't confront it too early. Let the liar believe the story is still working. I turned the screen back toward me and looked once more at the company name. Elite Wedding Designs. If this was a real company, someone would answer questions. If it wasn't, then Lucas Grant had just made a mistake far bigger than demanding $5 million at my table. Because the moment someone invents a company, they also create a trail. And if Lucas Grant really believed no one would follow that trail, then he had no idea who he had just tried to deceive. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I had slept well, but because my mind had already started connecting pieces that didn't quite fit together. By 7 o'clock I was back in my study. Coffee on the desk. Laptop open. Documents from the night before still spread across the table. The fake company website. The domain registration. The stolen wedding photographs. None of it was proof yet. But it was enough to ask the next question. Who had actually created Elite Wedding Designs? I checked the domain registration again. Most scammers hide their ownership behind private registrars. But sometimes people who believe they're smarter than everyone else get careless. This time, Lucas had been careful. The domain ownership was hidden behind a privacy service. No name. No direct contact. Just a generic email. But there was something else. The domain had been purchased through a hosting company based in Nevada. That alone meant nothing. But when people build fake companies, they rarely build only one. They reuse things. Emails. Phone numbers. Hosting accounts. Patterns. So I searched the hosting account ID connected to the domain. The results appeared a few seconds later. 3 other domains had been registered through the same account. All within the past year. The first one had already been taken down. The second redirected to an empty page. But the third one was still active. The name of the site appeared on my screen. Premier Luxury Events. I opened it. For a moment I just stared at the page. The design looked almost identical to Elite Wedding Designs. Same style. Same layout. Same fonts. And the photographs. They were familiar. Because they were the exact same photographs. Copied again. I leaned back in my chair slowly. This wasn't coincidence anymore. This was the beginning of a pattern. And patterns are the first language of fraud. I clicked through the pages. Testimonials. Luxury packages. Private planning services. Everything looked polished. But something on the About Us page caught my attention. A small paragraph describing the founder. Michael Carter, founder and director. I read it once. Then again. Because the face in the small profile photo looked strangely familiar. Not identical. But similar. Same jawline. Same eyes. Different haircut. Different name. But very possibly the same man. I zoomed in on the picture. And suddenly something else stood out. The photo had been taken in front of a building. A courthouse building. Not just any courthouse. One I recognized immediately. The Dallas County Courthouse. Which meant the photograph had been taken locally. Very locally. I saved the page. Downloaded the photo. And then I searched the name. Michael Carter, Dallas, Texas. The results appeared almost instantly. But none of them connected to wedding planning. Instead they led somewhere much more interesting. An old news article from 3 years earlier. I opened it. The headline appeared at the top of the page. Man arrested in Dallas romance scam investigation. My eyes moved quickly across the screen. The article described a small investigation involving several online fraud complaints. The suspect had been detained briefly. But the case had been dropped due to lack of evidence. The name of the suspect appeared halfway through the article. Michael Carter. And beneath the paragraph was a photograph. I leaned closer to the screen. The man in the photograph had shorter hair. A different beard. But the eyes were unmistakable. I opened Lucas's social media profile and placed the two photos side by side. Lucas Grant. Michael Carter. Two different names. But the same man. For several seconds I just stared at the screen. Then I quietly printed the article. If Lucas Grant had already been involved in a romance scam before, then my daughter might not be his first victim. Which meant something else was very possible. There might be other victims. And if that was true, then Lucas hadn't just tried to take advantage of my daughter. He had been practicing this for years. Upstairs I heard Emily moving again. The house was beginning to wake up. I looked back at the two photographs on my screen. Lucas Grant. Michael Carter. Two identities. One man. And suddenly the $5 million wedding demand made a lot more sense. Because it wasn't really about a wedding. It was about trust. And scams like this only work when someone believes the relationship is real. If Lucas had already done this before, then somewhere out there were other women who had believed him. Other families who had trusted him. Other people who had lost money they would never get back. And the more I looked at those two photographs on my screen, the more one question kept returning. If Lucas Grant had already done this before, how many lives had he already destroyed? For a long moment I kept staring at the two photographs on my desk. Lucas Grant. Michael Carter. Two names. One face. That alone would have been suspicious enough. But the article from 3 years ago suggested something worse. This wasn't a single lie. It looked like a pattern. And patterns rarely start with just one victim. So I kept digging. The article mentioned several complaints filed during the investigation, but it didn't list the names of the people involved. Only one detail stood out. One of the complaints had come from a woman in Austin. No name. No details. Just a location. I opened another browser window and started searching again. Romance scam. Dallas. Michael Carter. Austin. At first nothing appeared. Then, buried several pages deep in the results, I found something small. A discussion thread on an online forum about financial fraud. Most of the posts were old. 2 years. 3 years. But one comment stopped me. A user named Laura M. Her message was short. Be careful if you meet a man named Michael Carter in Dallas. He almost convinced me to invest in a wedding business with him. I lost nearly $200,000 before I realized something was wrong. I leaned forward slowly. $200,000. And the word wedding again. That couldn't be a coincidence. I opened the user profile. No photograph. No personal information. Just a username and a few comments scattered across the forum. But there was an email address attached to one of the posts. Not hidden. Just written casually at the bottom of a reply. Most people would have missed it. But after 35 years working fraud cases, you learn to notice the smallest openings. I copied the email address. For a few seconds I stared at the screen. Contacting her would change things. Until now, everything I had was research. Documents. Screenshots. Articles. But the moment you speak to a victim, the story becomes real. I opened my email. Typed slowly. Hello. My name is Daniel Whitaker. I believe we may have encountered the same man. If you have a moment to speak, I would appreciate it. I didn't mention Lucas. Not yet. I didn't mention my daughter either. Just the name from the article. Michael Carter. Then I sent the message. The house was quiet again. Upstairs I could hear Emily moving around her room. Probably getting ready for work. She still believed she was planning a wedding. I leaned back in my chair and watched the screen. 5 minutes passed. 10. Nothing. That was expected. People who lose money in scams rarely like to talk about it. Shame is often stronger than anger. I was about to close the laptop when a notification appeared. A reply. My cursor hovered over the message for a second before I opened it. The email was short. Only 2 lines. If you're asking about Michael Carter. Then yes. I know exactly who you're talking about. I felt a slow tightening in my chest. I kept reading. And if your family is dealing with him right now, you need to stop him immediately. There was a pause before the final line. Because when I realized what he had done, it was already too late. I stared at the screen. For the first time since the dinner, the situation felt heavier than suspicion. This wasn't just a lie. This was damage already done. I began typing again. But before I could finish the reply, another message appeared from Laura. This one was longer. You should know something else, she wrote. Michael Carter isn't his real name. I leaned closer to the screen. Another name appeared in the email. A third identity. And suddenly the man my daughter planned to marry no longer looked like a single fraud. He looked like someone who had been hiding behind different lives for a very long time. I sat back slowly. 3 names. 3 identities. And possibly many more victims. Which meant the problem sitting at my family dinner table wasn't just a greedy fiancé. It was something far more dangerous. Because men who live behind that many lies rarely stop on their own. And now that I had found the first victim, I intended to make sure Lucas Grant never found another one. For a long moment I kept staring at the 2 photographs on my desk. Lucas Grant. Michael Carter. 2 names. 1 face. That alone would have been suspicious enough. But the article from 3 years ago suggested something worse. This wasn't a single lie. It looked like a pattern. And patterns rarely start with just one victim. So I kept digging. The article mentioned several complaints filed during the investigation, but it didn't list the names of the people involved. Only one detail stood out. One of the complaints had come from a woman in Austin. No name. No details. Just a location. I opened another browser window and started searching again. Romance scam. Dallas. Michael Carter. Austin. At first nothing appeared. Then, buried several pages deep in the results, I found something small. A discussion thread on an online forum about financial fraud. Most of the posts were old. 2 years. 3 years. But one comment stopped me. A user named Laura M. Her message was short. Be careful if you meet a man named Michael Carter in Dallas. He almost convinced me to invest in a wedding business with him. I lost nearly $200,000 before I realized something was wrong. I leaned forward slowly. $200,000. And the word wedding again. That couldn't be a coincidence. I opened the user profile. No photograph. No personal information. Just a username and a few comments scattered across the forum. But there was an email address attached to one of the posts. Not hidden. Just written casually at the bottom of a reply. Most people would have missed it. But after 35 years working fraud cases, you learn to notice the smallest openings. I copied the email address. For a few seconds I stared at the screen. Contacting her would change things. Until now, everything I had was research. Documents. Screenshots. Articles. But the moment you speak to a victim, the story becomes real. I opened my email. typed slowly. Hello. My name is Daniel Whitaker. I believe we may have encountered the same man. If you have a moment to speak, I would appreciate it. I didn't mention Lucas. Not yet. I didn't mention my daughter either. Just the name from the article. Michael Carter. Then I sent the message. The house was quiet again. Upstairs I could hear Emily moving around her room. Probably getting ready for work. She still believed she was planning a wedding. I leaned back in my chair and watched the screen. 5 minutes passed. 10. Nothing. That was expected. People who lose money in scams rarely like to talk about it. Shame is often stronger than anger. I was about to close the laptop when a notification appeared. A reply. My cursor hovered over the message for a second before I opened it. The email was short. Only 2 lines. If you're asking about Michael Carter. Then yes. I know exactly who you're talking about. I felt a slow tightening in my chest. I kept reading. And if your family is dealing with him right now, you need to stop him immediately. There was a pause before the final line. Because when I realized what he had done, it was already too late. I stared at the screen. For the first time since the dinner, the situation felt heavier than suspicion. This wasn't just a lie. This was damage already done. I began typing again. But before I could finish the reply, another message appeared from Laura. This one was longer. You should know something else, she wrote. Michael Carter isn't his real name. I leaned closer to the screen. Another name appeared in the email. A third identity. And suddenly the man my daughter planned to marry no longer looked like a single fraud. He looked like someone who had been hiding behind different lives for a very long time. I sat back slowly. 3 names. 3 identities. And possibly many more victims. Which meant the problem sitting at my family dinner table wasn't just a greedy fiancé. It was something far more dangerous. Because men who live behind that many lies rarely stop on their own. And now that I had found the first victim. Laura called that afternoon. Not a long conversation at first. Just a cautious voice on the other end of the phone. I received your email, she said quietly. Her voice carried the hesitation of someone who had already trusted the wrong person once. Are you really dealing with Michael Carter? I believe so, I answered. But the man I know is calling himself Lucas Grant. There was silence on the line. Then a short, bitter laugh. Of course he is. That reaction told me everything I needed to know. You recognize the face? I asked. Yes, she said immediately. I'd recognize it anywhere. Her voice hardened. That man took $200,000 from me. I didn't interrupt. People who have been deceived rarely need encouragement to tell their story. They only need someone who is willing to listen. We met at a charity event, Laura continued. He said he worked in luxury event planning. Weddings, corporate galas, private clients. The same story. Almost word for word. He was charming, she said. Confident. He knew exactly what to say. That sounds familiar, I replied. At first he never talked about money, she continued. That came later. I already knew the pattern. Trust first. Money later. He said we could start a business together, she said. A high-end wedding planning company. Elite Wedding Designs. Or whatever name he was using at the time. He showed me websites, she said. Photos of luxury weddings. I looked at the screenshots on my desk. Were the photos real? I asked. Yes, she said. Real weddings. Just not his. Laura exhaled slowly. It took months before I realized something wasn't right. What happened? I asked. The deposits, she said. They kept getting delayed. Vendors stopped answering emails. The planner he introduced me to disappeared. Another fake company. Another fake partner. Then one day he stopped answering my calls. Her voice tightened. His apartment was empty. His phone was disconnected. His social media accounts were gone. I had seen that ending before. Disappearing is the final step of many scams. And the police? I asked. I reported it, she said. But there wasn't enough evidence. The money had already been moved through several accounts. Which meant the investigation had died before it really began. That's when I found the article you mentioned, she said quietly. The one about the investigation? Yes. But they never proved it was him. I looked again at the two photographs beside my keyboard. Lucas Grant. Michael Carter. They will this time, I said calmly. Laura was silent for a moment. Then she asked the question I had been expecting. Who is he trying to scam now? My daughter, I said. Another long pause. Then you need to stop him fast, she said. I intend to. Because he doesn't stop, Laura added. What do you mean? He keeps moving, she said. Different cities. Different names. Different stories. She hesitated. And different women. I wrote a few notes as she spoke. Do you still have any messages from him? I asked. Yes, she said. Emails. Text messages. Contracts. Contracts. That word caught my attention. He sent you contracts. Yes, she said. Fake ones, probably. Can you send them to me? There was another pause. You're building a case, she said. Yes. And if I help you, what happens to him? I looked at the documents already spread across my desk. The fake company. The stolen photographs. The old investigation. And now a real victim. If everything I suspect is true, I said quietly. He won't be planning any more weddings. Laura let out a slow breath. Good, she said. Because I've spent 3 years wishing someone would finally stop him. The call ended a few minutes later. Within half an hour the documents began arriving in my inbox. Emails. Invoices. Draft contracts. And something even more interesting. A copy of the identification he had shown Laura when they first met. I opened the file. The photograph was unmistakable. But the name printed on the ID was neither Lucas Grant nor Michael Carter. It was something else entirely. A third name. And suddenly the man who had demanded $5 million at my dinner table looked less like a fiancé. And more like a professional con artist. Which meant the next step was no longer just protecting my daughter. Now it was about proving what he really was. And once that happened, Lucas Grant's wedding plans were going to collapse very quickly. I intended to make sure Lucas Grant never found another one. By the time Laura's documents finished downloading, my desk looked less like a home office and more like the beginning of a case file. Emails. Contracts. Invoices. Screenshots. And 3 different names connected to the same man. Lucas Grant. Michael Carter. And the third name printed on the identification Laura had sent. Daniel Hayes. 3 identities. Each one attached to a slightly different version of the same story. Luxury events. Private clients. Investment opportunities. And always a relationship involved somewhere in the middle. I leaned back in my chair and studied the timeline Laura had described. 6 months of trust. 3 months of planning. $200,000 transferred through 3 separate accounts. Then silence. Disappearance. A new city. A new name. And eventually, a new victim. Upstairs I could hear Emily moving through the house. Cupboards opening. Coffee brewing. The quiet sounds of someone starting an ordinary day. Except nothing about the situation was ordinary anymore. I looked again at the folder from dinner still sitting on my desk. Lucas's $5 million wedding proposal. For a moment I imagined what would have happened if I had simply agreed. If I had transferred the $2 million deposit he requested. The rest of the story would have been very simple. The wedding planner would delay the venue. The vendors would stop responding. And eventually Lucas Grant would disappear the same way he had before. Only this time the loss wouldn't be $200,000. It would be millions. But the money was only part of it. The real damage would have been Emily. Trust takes years to build. But it only takes one person like Lucas to destroy it. My phone vibrated softly on the desk. A new email from Laura. More documents. More messages. And one small detail I hadn't expected. A bank transfer receipt. I opened it. The payment Laura had sent 3 years ago hadn't gone to the wedding company. It had been routed through a temporary consulting firm. A shell company. The name appeared clearly on the document. Northbridge Consulting Group. Another company. Another layer. I typed the name into the business registry. The result appeared almost instantly. Registered 18 months ago. Closed 6 months later. Director, Daniel Hayes. The third name again. Which meant Lucas had been using at least 3 identities to move money through different companies. A simple pattern. A dangerous one. Because schemes like that rarely leave clean trails. But they always leave something. And that was when I realized something important. Lucas still believed everything was working. He believed Emily trusted him. He believed I was simply a cautious father asking a few questions. He had no idea that the story had already started unraveling. Which meant I had something extremely valuable. Time. I stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen. Emily sat at the table with a cup of coffee. She looked up when I entered. "Morning," she said. "Morning." She studied my face carefully. "You didn't sleep much, did you?" "Not really." She hesitated before asking the question that had clearly been on her mind since the dinner. "Did you find anything?" I poured myself a cup of coffee before answering. "A few things." Her expression tightened. "Bad things?" "Suspicious things." Emily stared down at the table. "I knew something felt wrong," she said quietly. I sat down across from her. "Emily," I said gently, "has Lucas ever asked you to keep things secret?" She nodded slowly. "He said wealthy clients value privacy." That was exactly the answer I expected. "And has he talked about the deposit again?" "Yes." Her voice became smaller. "He texted me this morning." "What did he say?" "That the venue won't hold the date much longer." "Of course it wouldn't. Pressure is the oldest trick in fraud." "Did you respond?" "No." She looked up at me. "What should I say?" I took a slow sip of coffee. Then I placed the cup down. "Tell him we're ready to move forward." Emily blinked. "What?" "Tell him the deposit is possible," I said calmly. "But that I want one meeting first." "The meeting with the planner?" "Yes." Emily stared at me. "But if he's lying?" "Then that meeting will be very interesting." She hesitated. "Dad, what are you planning?" I smiled faintly. "Nothing complicated. Just the truth. Because people like Lucas Grant build their entire lives around one assumption. That no one will ever look closely enough to see the cracks." Emily picked up her phone slowly. "You're sure about this?" "Yes." She typed the message while I watched. A few seconds later her phone vibrated. Lucas had replied almost immediately. What did he say? I asked. Emily looked down at the screen. Her eyes widened slightly. He says the planner is available tomorrow afternoon. I nodded. Perfect. Because the moment Lucas agreed to that meeting, he had just walked straight into the worst possible place for a professional liar. A room full of questions. And this time, I intended to bring answers with me. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. Lucas chose the location himself. A private office suite in a newly renovated building near downtown Dallas. The kind of place that looked impressive from the outside but was often rented by the hour. Emily sat beside me in the car as we pulled into the parking lot. Are you sure about this? She asked quietly. Yes. My answer was simple. Because by that point the meeting was no longer about the wedding. It was about watching Lucas explain a story that was already falling apart. Lucas was waiting for us inside. He greeted Emily with a warm smile and a quick kiss on the cheek. Then he turned to me. Glad you could make it, he said confidently. His confidence hadn't changed. Which meant he still believed he was in control. That depends, I replied calmly. On what? On the planner. Lucas laughed softly. You'll like her. We walked down a short hallway into a small conference room. A woman was already sitting at the table. Mid-30s. Professional suit. Laptop open. She stood up when we entered. Mr. Whitaker, she said politely. I'm Michelle Lawson. Lucas gestured toward her. Our wedding planner. She offered me her hand. I shook it. Her grip was firm. But her eyes moved quickly between me and Lucas. Almost as if she was measuring the room. We all sat down. Michelle opened a presentation on her laptop. I understand you have some questions about the event planning process, she said. That's correct, I replied. She began speaking with practiced confidence. The venue Lucas selected is one of the most exclusive locations in Texas. The floral design alone requires several international suppliers. Lucas nodded approvingly beside her. Emily stayed quiet. I listened for a few minutes before opening the folder I had brought with me. Michelle, I said calmly, how long has your company been operating? She smiled. Several years. That's interesting. Why? I slid a printed document across the table. The domain registration for Elite Wedding Designs shows the website was created 4 months ago. Michelle looked down at the paper. Her smile faded slightly. Lucas leaned forward. That's just the website, he said quickly. The company existed before that. Of course, I said calmly. I placed another sheet of paper on the table. The business registry shows no company under that name in Texas. The room became quiet. Michelle glanced briefly at Lucas. Lucas cleared his throat. We operate privately for high-profile clients. I nodded slowly. Then perhaps you can explain the photographs. Michelle looked confused. What photographs? I slid several printed images across the table. Wedding photographs from the website. And the originals from the venues where they had actually been taken. These weddings belong to other planners, I said quietly. Michelle stared at the pictures. Lucas's expression hardened. This is ridiculous, he said. Is it? I placed one final document on the table. The article Laura had sent. The headline faced Lucas. Man arrested in Dallas romance scam investigation. Lucas didn't touch the paper. But he didn't look away from it either. For the first time since we met, the calm confidence in his face cracked. Only slightly. But enough. Emily looked from Lucas to me. Lucas, she said softly. Lucas finally pushed the article away. This is insane, he said. But his voice had lost its certainty. I leaned back in my chair. Is it? Michelle slowly closed her laptop. Her eyes moved from the documents, to Lucas. Then back to me. I think, she said carefully, there may have been some misunderstanding. Lucas stood up suddenly. This meeting is over. But I didn't move. Instead I reached into my folder one last time. And placed a final document on the table. A bank transfer receipt Laura had sent earlier that morning. $200,000. Transferred to Northbridge Consulting Group. Director, Daniel Hayes. Lucas stared at the paper. His jaw tightened. Emily looked at him again. Lucas, what is this? Lucas didn't answer. For several seconds the room was completely silent. Then I spoke. Very calmly. Your problem, I said, is that you use 3 different names. Lucas slowly turned his head toward me. And eventually, I continued. People start comparing them. Outside the conference room, I heard footsteps in the hallway. The door opened. 2 men stepped inside. Plain suits. Dallas police badges clipped to their belts. Lucas looked at them. Then back at me. And for the first time since the dinner. He finally understood what was happening. Because the meeting he thought would secure a $5 million wedding had just turned into something very different. An investigation. And this time, he wasn't the one asking the questions. For a moment, no one in the room moved. Lucas stood frozen beside the table. The 2 detectives stepped inside and quietly closed the door behind them. No raised voices. No sudden movement. Just the quiet shift that happens when a lie finally runs out of space. Mr. Hayes, one of the detectives said calmly. Lucas didn't respond. Or do you prefer Carter, the detective added. Lucas looked from the officers, to the documents on the table, and finally to me. His expression had changed completely. The confidence was gone. So was the charm. In its place was the cold calculation of someone trying to find a way out of a situation that no longer had one. This is a misunderstanding, he said. The word sounded automatic. Like a sentence he had used before. One of the detectives nodded slightly. You can explain that downtown. Lucas didn't move. For a moment it looked like he might try to argue. Then his shoulders dropped. Emily sat perfectly still beside me. She hadn't spoken since the officers entered the room. Lucas glanced at her. Emily. But she didn't answer. The detective stepped closer. Sir, one of them said quietly, we're going to need you to come with us. Lucas looked back at me. Not angry. Not even surprised. Just, defeated. You planned this, he said. I held his gaze calmly. No, I replied. You planned it. The detective placed a hand on Lucas's arm. And just like that, the meeting was over. No shouting. No dramatic scene. Just the quiet end of a very long lie. Lucas Grant. Michael Carter. Daniel Hayes. Whatever name he had used before didn't really matter anymore. Because for the first time in years, he was finally going to have to answer questions he couldn't walk away from. The detectives led him out of the room. The door closed behind them. Emily exhaled slowly. Her hands were still shaking. I can't believe it, she whispered. I nodded once. That's how these men work. She stared at the empty chair where Lucas had been sitting. How long do you think he's been doing this? Long enough to believe no one would ever stop him. Michelle Lawson, the woman who had introduced herself as the wedding planner, sat silently on the other side of the table. I didn't know, she said quietly. I was hired yesterday. That didn't surprise me. People like Lucas often hire temporary help to make their stories look real. Another disposable detail in a disposable life. Emily wiped her eyes and looked at me. "Thank you," she said. "You saved me." I shook my head gently. "You saved yourself." She frowned slightly. "How?" "You trusted your instincts," I said. "And you passed me that note." For a moment she was silent. Then she smiled faintly. "A very small note. Sometimes that's enough." We left the building a few minutes later. The afternoon sun was bright. The parking lot looked exactly the same as when we arrived. But everything felt different. Emily stood beside the car for a moment. "What happens to him now?" she asked. I looked toward the street where the police car had disappeared. "That depends on how many people he's done this to." "Do you think there are others?" "Yes. But now they'll have a chance to speak." Emily nodded slowly. Then she took a deep breath. "I guess there won't be a wedding." I smiled slightly. "No. But I think that's something we can both live with." She laughed softly. For the first time since the dinner, the tension in her shoulders finally disappeared. We got into the car. And as we drove away, I thought about something I had learned many years earlier. People like Lucas believe silence protects them. They believe embarrassment will stop their victims from speaking. Most of the time. They're right. But every once in a while, someone decides to ask questions. And when that happens, the truth has a way of catching up with even the most careful lies. Thank you for listening. Calm justice doesn't shout. It keeps records.